The latest episode of me playing around with trying to computerize some old Europa war games. This time I'm taking a little bit of a different tack. Instead of working on individual scenarios like my Blitz 41 version of Fire in the East and so on. I'm trying to tackle something a little bit different. It's a resources and production module for Grand Europa. And my idea is that eventually this would be part of what I hope will be a multiplayer, computerized, web-based version of Grand Europa that is tying all the games together, played with the Game Master. A lot of the pieces for that are already in place, but one of the things that hasn't appeared yet in any of the published games or in anything that I've been working on deals with the highest level of resources and production for each individual nation or government or territory or whatever in a Grand Europa campaign. So we're talking about having to deal with technology, manpower, raw materials, agriculture, oil, factories and production, and then the way that players can create ground units, air units, and naval units based on the way that they have utilized all these different aspects of their wartime economies. So I'm still working on it. I still have a lot to do, but I think there's enough here to show and give an idea of what's going on. Three important caveats before we get going into this is, first of all, it is still very much in progress. I'm still doing testing and experimenting. There's so much to this. There's so many important things. If you paid any attention at all to World War II, then you know that manpower shortages happened everywhere, that agriculture and foodstuff was a problem almost everywhere. And we can't really leave those things out completely if we're talking about resources and production in a grand campaign like this. But it's important to cut out as much as we can. I mean, my gosh, the games are already so complicated. If we're going to have to add this module on top of it, we want to trim it down as much as possible. So I'm still deciding what to leave in and what to leave out, but these icons give you a pretty good idea of the kinds of things that we're going to have to deal with. The second important point here is that for debugging and demonstration purposes, I've created the nation of Mordor over here, and Mordor just allows me to play around with some things without worrying about what their real capabilities were. So we're going to be looking at Mordor here, but don't worry, it's not a country that you have overlooked in Europe. So the third thing is that there are a lot of internal inconsistencies in here because I'm still playing around with it for testing and for demo. You'll see, for example, in some places it might say that Mordor has a factory. In some other places it will say, well, Mordor doesn't have a factory, and that's okay. You know, this system will eventually have all of that working exactly it's supposed to. Right now it's just for me testing, debugging, and doing a demo of this. So we're going to assume right now that it is January of 1941 and a grand campaign game, which has gone not quite the same as the actual historical World War II went. If we were looking at being the team of players for the government of Germany in January 1941, we have, in addition to Germany itself, we have Mordor, a nation under Germany's control. We have Poland, which has been conquered and is under German control. We have parts of the Soviet Union under German control, and we have Denmark under German control. The way this is set up, we could incorporate various territories, either, for example, all of Denmark or part of Denmark could be taken into Germany. So things can be treated either as separate individual economies, or they could just become part of the German economy. So what we're seeing here is just an overview of what's happening at the beginning of the resources and production phase for January 1941 for Germany, and we're going to play around with Mordor and see what we can come up with. So we'll jump into it here, and we have a menu that allows us to deal with all these different aspects of the wartime economy for Mordor. Now keep in mind, a lot of this is going to look a little bit weird because it's just set up for demo purposes. There will probably never be any country or territory in the game that has all the things going on that Mordor has going on. So the first thing we want to look at is pending transfers. So we'll click over here, and transfers can be of just about anything. You can transfer oil points, agricultural points. You can transfer manpower points. You can transfer aircraft points that you've created in your own factories. And those transfers can be either imports or exports. Now, Mordor, as we'll see, is a small, poor nation with not much going on in the way of wartime economy, without a lot of factories and stuff. So in reality, a nation like that would probably be doing imports of things like tanks, if they can get them, and exporting things like manpower and agricultural products. In this case, Mordor can say, I want to export certain things, and Mordor can accept imports of things that somebody else is sending. So for example, not that this would necessarily happen, but Germany might send some tanks to Mordor in exchange for agricultural products. On the other hand, because Germany controls Mordor, Germany might just say, send me the agriculture and you're not getting anything in return. That's the kind of stuff that can happen in a Grand Europa campaign. So the first thing we're looking at is the status of some of these imports and exports, and we can look at the details down here. So manpower, for the incoming manpower, Mordor can accept it right now and can do so individually. For manpower that's being sent away, if it hasn't been accepted by the nation that's receiving it, if it hasn't yet been accepted, then Mordor could cancel it and say, never mind, I'm not going to send it. Again, this is kind of an odd setup. I've said, oh yeah, we're going to get some manpower coming in from the Shire and from Orkland, but we're going to send some manpower out to Germany and to Italy or whatever, or we can release manpower that previously came to us from someplace. I don't know how much of that will actually happen in the sense that manpower is coming and going from the same country, but we set that up for demo purposes here. Raw materials, same thing. Raw materials could be imported or exported. Agricultural points, which are really important, very important. It seems like it's a far cry from playing around with Panzers and Spitfires and stuff, but agriculture is a very important part of the war economy, which makes it an important part of the production and resources module here. So there's also oil, and oil, of course, is so important that it has its own tracking in addition to the other raw materials that we track. And then there's factory production. If we look down here, and we can see supplies, equipment, armored fighting vehicles, aircraft, or various kinds of factory production that could be imported and exported depending on what the country needs or what somebody needs from this country. Here I'm kind of messing that around a little bit. All right, so we could do those things individually, or we could just say, I want to accept all the incoming and import stuff that's due to arrive in this cycle. So one click would do it, or you can go in here and do them individually. Or if for any reason you needed to, you could say, I want to cancel everything that I said I'm going to export. If it hasn't been accepted by the recipient yet, I want to cancel it because I want to think about it again. Maybe I will send it and maybe I won't. All right, so that's just to take care of all those imports and exports right away at the beginning. As we'll see in a minute, we're still going to have a chance to deal with those individually. For example, when we get into the agricultural part of this module, we'll see the agricultural imports and the agricultural exports for Mordor, and we can do the same thing there if we want to. Just for the agriculture, we could accept or cancel as needed. So we'll go back to the menu here, and the next thing that we'll look at is technology. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot to show in technology right now. I've gone round and round and trying to decide how I want to deal with this. Again, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, but still cover all the bases. There are important things here about the technology level. If you take a country like Mordor or Albania or someplace, they are probably never going to be able to produce T-34s or Tiger tanks. But maybe if they can get the right technology, maybe they could produce some tankettes or something, some light tanks, possibly so. Likewise, right off the bat, Germany is not going to be able to produce V1s and V2s in 1939 or 1940, but eventually they could reach the technology level where they could start producing those. So I've approached this from a couple different directions on how I want to make the technology work, and I haven't decided yet. So for the moment, I really don't have much to show about technology, except to say that for each type of factory, there will be a technology level which indicates what that particular factory for that nation can produce. So we'll see a little bit of that, and eventually I'll have this technology stuff a little more squared away. So we'll go back to the menu, and now for this part of the phase, we need to deal with resources. Resources are broken up into three areas: manpower, raw material, agriculture, and oil. We'll see an overview of some of that information right here, and we can go into each one of these to see more detail about each one. Manpower. Manpower is so critical. I think every single participant in World War II had manpower limitations. I mean, for goodness sake, even the United States, which I sometimes think of as having more or less unlimited manpower, that wasn't really true at all. Even in terms of agriculture, which we'll be looking at in a few minutes, there were so much of the manpower was gone off to fight the war that the U.S. had to use a lot of people who would not normally have been involved in agriculture, including POWs and the guest worker program, the Bracero program. So everybody, including the United States, is going to have to figure out, did they want to use parts of their population to be in the military, to be part of the labor force? Are they able to get military manpower of military quality from their allies or from places that they have conquered? And will they be utilizing foreign labor, which could be, I don't want to get into this too much, but it could be guest workers, forced workers, slave workers, and that includes POWs, which I have some rules on how, depending on how combat goes, you can gradually accumulate POWs who you might be able to utilize as labor or potentially even as part of your military forces. So we're seeing here what's going on with manpower for Mordor. We can see at the beginning of this turn, for each one of these different classifications, we can see what's assigned, and that is they're already doing something. So we have 100 points in the military, 300 points in labor, 3 points of foreign military on hand, and 9 points of foreign labor on hand. Unassigned mean it's just in the pool and it's available. new means that however it arrived, either because you have a new class of a new age class that comes up that becomes available, or because a foreign government sent you some manpower to work in your factories or in your agriculture. So new manpower can arrive. Pending incoming, pending outgoing, because maybe you are sending some of your manpower to someplace else. So looking at Mordor here, under German control, they seem to have a pretty tight manpower situation. They have total unassigned manpower, only 1 point, and that's foreign labor. So they don't have much. They couldn't suddenly say, well, we need to mobilize some more ground troops. Well, where's the manpower going to come from? Are you going to take them from your labor pool? And as we'll see in a minute, you probably don't want to do that, because you probably need them in your labor pool as agricultural workers, because if you don't have enough agricultural workers, then you're not going to get enough food. And if you don't get enough food, then you're going to start into a downward spiral of you're going to produce less food, you're going to have less efficient armed forces, and you're going to have less efficient factory output. So anyway, we'll look at all this. We'll run down here. We can see the manpower points for the military for Mordor. We can view the details of that. And if we pop this up here, and it shows us that from Orkland and Trollheim, I know those are very clever, aren't they? We have some units in the Mordor armed forces that are made up of troops that have come from those places. I suppose if I pull this down a little bit, we can see that better. So industry requires a lot of manpower, and you're going to have to make some decisions. We know, for example, that Germany put most of its native manpower into the armed forces, and they had to bring in workers, not necessarily in a very savory fashion, in order to take care of industry and agriculture. As a player, you're going to have to make those kinds of decisions, and everybody is going to be very tight in manpower. So we can look at the manpower points in foreign service, releasing points from foreign service, all these things. As we saw some of this previously, you can accept and cancel as you wish to do so. And we could set up some more transfers. We'll go here to manage this manpower. So we can do internal transfers that maybe you have some unassigned points that you want to assign to industry or to agriculture. Maybe you have some points in industry that you say, man, I got to put this into agriculture because I don't have enough agricultural workers. Your military manpower points, which is what we're looking up here at the top, they can be used for all those things. Military manpower is qualified to work for military, for industry, or for agriculture. On the other hand, we have labor manpower points, and that's that part of your population which is not qualified to be in the military, but can work in either industry or agriculture. So depending on the nation, some nations are more likely to assign certain portions of their population to certain areas, whether it's military, or agriculture, or industry, and so there'll be some limits on a nation-by-nation basis. But in general, you will be able to transfer those points from one place to another. And then you've got your foreign labor manpower points, so you could bring in the manpower from, what do we have here, the Shire or Orkland or whatever, and assign them into agriculture and industry. So anyway, this is the screen that allows you to control all those things. So you can see, I mentioned earlier that some of this stuff is very important, but it's adding a lot of complications. And my goal here is to cover all the bases, but still make it as easy to understand as possible, and to make the interface as clean as possible so that it doesn't take forever and it doesn't take a spreadsheet on the side to figure out how you're going to assign points to agriculture, industry, and the military, and so forth. All right, so we'll go back up to the manpower menu, and we'll say that's probably good for playing around with manpower. We will go back to the main menu for Mordor here, and now let's look at raw materials. Now, I decided that it's way too complicated to try to look at things like coal, iron ore, manganese, nickel, whatever. We're not going to look at those things individually. Oil is the only thing that's broken out individually from raw materials. Everything else is just plain old raw material. So it could be coal, iron ore, or anything else. You have to have raw materials in order to feed the factories that are going to produce armaments. You also have to have manpower to dig up the raw materials. So we look at all these different things here. We could view the friendly owned raw material hexes on the map. We can see that we have the following points and stockpiled, newly available because they just got dug up and became available this cycle, total available. We could have some imports. So possibly somebody is sending some raw material points to Mordor. In this case, I'm showing it would be 3 arriving in this cycle and 1 due to arrive in an upcoming cycle. The ones that are arriving now we can accept right away. The ones that are going to arrive in the future, we won't be able to accept them until that turn actually gets here. We'll also have some exports. This is kind of silly to be simultaneously importing and exporting the same thing. I don't think anybody would really do that, but I set it up just for demo purposes so you can see that you can import and export raw materials. The number here required, it's saying that you've got to have 2 points of raw materials in order to feed your currently functioning factories. You could have those factories, you could have 100 factories, but if you don't have enough raw materials, you're not going to be able to produce armaments with all of those factories. The start of turn and now just up, this stays the same, and the now updates automatically as you make any changes to it, so you can see what the current situation is as you're working your way through what you're doing. So raw material sites for Mordor, we can look and see that some of the sites are functioning, some are closed, some are destroyed, some are undergoing repair. At the start of the turn, we had this number of sites producing this number of points. Right now, based on what we have done so far, this is getting updated. It says we now have this number of sites and this number of points, and we can go in there and manage that. So for any site, we could say we want to close the site. We could pick which site we want to close, and we could click to close it. We can open one that's currently closed. We could destroy one. We could go down and repair one which has been destroyed. We can cancel that repair, and we still have the ability to cancel or accept transfers of raw material points. So this allows you to deal at a very granular level with each of your raw material sites, which are usually located on map. In some cases, they're off map. So, the United States, for example, will have a lot of raw material sources that we'll never see on the map, and that's also true of places like the Soviet Union and so forth. All right, we'll go back up to the raw material menu, and we see the manpower points, because you've got to have manpower in order to get the raw materials in order to feed the factories. We can view the details. Let me pull this down a little bit so we can see who's actually working to dig up your coal or to extract your iron ore or do that sort of thing. We can manage that manpower if we say we want to, and this is basically the same thing that we saw in the manpower part of the module here. We could take any unassigned manpower points and assign them to industry, and this would say get these. Now here, as I said, there are a lot of internal inconsistencies. I've shown in this case that there is a lot of available unassigned manpower points that could be assigned to industry. We saw the previous screen that says that was not the case, and this is just set up for demo purposes, so I'd have some stuff to click on. So we could release manpower points from industry, and they would then become unassigned, and once they're unassigned, we could move them into agriculture, or we could release them to go back to the nation that they came from. If it's foreign labor, we could say, well, we don't need your foreign labor points anymore, go back to where you came from. So we go back here, and this is the raw materials menu where we just were a minute ago. We'll hop back up to the main menu for Mordor. So the third one that we'll look at is agriculture. Agriculture is very similar to raw materials. This is all set up more or less in parallel, so once you're familiar with one, the other one will be pretty easy, but they are separate things, and they're equally important. Agriculture might even be more important than raw materials, maybe. I'm not sure about that. I am sure that we can't leave agriculture out of the equation, though. So here we can see agricultural points at the start of the turn, and now, meaning after we've made any changes along the way. So we have some stockpile, we have some new total available, we have some coming in and some going out, and again, that's kind of silly. A nation probably wouldn't have both of those things happening, but maybe. And the requirement is 10, that if we don't have at least 10 agricultural points to apply to Mordor's economy this turn, that means there will be some deleterious effects here. We could lose agriculture points in the future. Our industry won't produce as well, and probably our armed forces will not be at full efficiency just because we don't have enough food. So we need to sometimes transfer points, and we can transfer points from Mordor. We could send some points off to wherever we want it to go, Germany or Italy probably in this case, because it seems to be an Axis-aligned nation since it's under Germany's control. We can go back here to this menu. We can see where our agricultural sites are, again, generally on map, sometimes off map. We can manage those sites. We might want to suspend cultivation. It's possible that a nation will control more agricultural sites than it needs in order to supply all the points required. And so we could suspend cultivation at an agricultural site in order to release the manpower, because maybe we need that manpower in industry, or maybe that's even military capable manpower, and we can send it off to the armed forces to create some new units. So we can suspend cultivation and we can resume cultivation, and all the choices are on there, so you can manage the manpower at your agricultural sites. And we look down here, more managing of manpower for agricultural sites, and this allows you to get down to the very granular level of saying, well, I happen to have manpower from the Shire working at this agricultural site, but I want to release them because I'm going to send them back to the Shire for whatever reason. So I'm going to release the Shire manpower and replace it with manpower that I happen to have transferred to me from Orkland or the Trolls or whatever. All right, so that's agriculture. And we can go back up to the menu here, and we can look at oil. Oil, of course, is so crucially important that it has to have its own part of the module here. And we can see that in order for Mordor to sustain its wartime economy, it needs to have 2 points to it for every cycle. A cycle, by the way, being 3 turns, 1/4 of a year. I should say 3 months, 6 game turns. So We can look at the friendly owned oil hexes on the map. Most of the oil hexes, I think, are actually going to be off map, or at least a significant proportion of them will be off map. We can view the ones that are on the map so we know where they are. We can look at the points. So we've got 1 point stockpiled. We're getting 2 new ones coming from our own oil production, apparently. Total available of 3. We have some imports and some exports. Again, it's kind of silly to be both importing and exporting oil here, but just to show how it works, with the first number being this turn and the second number being in a future turn. We know that we have 2 required. That was for the start of the turn. We see now, this is after we made any changes, we can see what the situation is. We can transfer oil points, just like we were able to transfer agricultural points, like we can transfer manpower to a different government. And here it's saying, well, we have total of 3 available, so we can transfer a maximum of 3. Where do we want to send it? Well, we could send it to Germany or Italy because they are friends of Mordor. And in fact, Germany actually controls Mordor here. So we'll go back to the oil menu, oil sites. If you want to manage your oil sites, you can destroy them. You can repair them after they've been destroyed. You can cancel the repair while it's underway. You can say, never mind, I don't want to spend the resources to do that. Forget it, I'm not going to repair it, I'm going to cancel that. But if you want to destroy one, you would just pick it from there. If you wanted to repair one that was already destroyed, you pick it from there. So that's oil. If you don't have enough oil points to run your economy, then there will definitely be some bad things happening. It means that you will find that no matter how many factories you have, and no matter how much manpower you have, and no matter how many raw materials you have to feed those factories, the factories are not going to produce at 100% capacity. So you won't get all the stuff that you would normally get. All the armaments that would normally be produced by that factory, you will only get a lesser percentage of them if you don't have enough oil points on hand to sustain your war economy. That's also true for your armed forces. Some things are going to start happening depending on how big the shortage is. You might find out that your combat motorized units can no longer move during the exploitation phase. And there'll be various problems of that nature. So it's important to get a hold of oil. Gosh, where have we heard that before? So that's why oil is separated out from the other raw materials and natural resources that we have here. So we'll go back to here. And then that takes us, after resources, we'll go over here to number 4, production and factories. So everything that we've looked at so far is leading up to production and factories. So technology, which I'm kind of skimming over for the moment, manpower, raw materials, agriculture, and oil all have some bearing on what's happening with production and factories. So we'll take a look at that. And we can see that the raw material points required for Mordor's currently open factories, 2. We need 2 raw material points. And raw material points that would be required for closed factories, 0, because Mordor doesn't have any factories that are closed right now. So we're starting to look at the raw materials, even though we're in the factory and production area here, because we've got to have those raw materials, and we can actually jump right back over to the raw materials area if we want to. So this is the same stuff that we've seen previously for raw materials. The numbers might be a little bit different, just because I was testing out some things and I wanted to see how stuff worked there. So now we get down to the production points for Mordor. One important thing is supply points. Everything that I've done for the resources and production module that I'm working on fits very nicely with the previous experimental supply system that I built, where not just in the desert, but in all the games, all the fronts, all the campaigns, supply points are required. And supply points need to be spent for units at the beginning of every player turn, and you have to spend more if you want to attack. And combat motorized units require more supply points than infantry units. So all that stuff is already in place with the experimental supply module that I put together. And this dovetails with that, and it's telling us that for mortars of armed forces, if you want to sustain those armed forces with supply points, you need 24 supply points in order to do that. And that's assuming there are no attacks, because if mortars armed forces attack, and that will eat up more supply. So the minimum is 24 just to keep everybody in supply. So now we look, and again, we have start of turn, and now for supplies, we can see there's a 0 stockpile, but thank goodness we produced 100 supply points. So we have plenty of supply points available this turn to sustain the armed forces. What that's going to translate to is in the next phase, those supply points are going to automatically show up on the map at the appropriate places, and then during the supply phase and the movement phase, as usual, those points can be distributed and utilized. Pending imports, pending exports, and we have that for each of the different types of factories. So what we're seeing here is a list of the different kinds of factories. Depending on how this goes, I might be able to whittle this down and make it slightly easier to comprehend by having fewer types of factories, or I might have to go the other way and add a couple more types of factories. But I think this is going to do it. So you can have factories that are dedicated to producing supplies, equipment, artillery, vehicles, AFVs, aircraft, and ships. So if you have a factory that you built and said, I want this to be an artillery factory, well, artillery is the only thing that it can produce. Now, it can produce different kinds of artillery, and that's in part due to the technology level. So, for example, if Mordor does build an artillery factory, and for artillery it has a tech level of 1, then it couldn't produce, for example, railroad artillery or coastal artillery or something like that. It would need a higher tech level. Likewise, just because you can produce aircraft, you would need a much higher tech level if you wanted to have this aircraft factory start producing V-weapons. Anyway, so we can see for each type of factory what is the the stockpile of points, how many new arriving this turn, the total available, imports, exports, and based on what we have done or not done so far this turn, we can see how those numbers change over here. We can transfer production points just like we can transfer anything else. In this case, we don't have much to send anywhere. We have some supplies, we have some equipment, but we're not producing anything else as far as this screen knows anyway. We're not producing anything else. On the other hand, because we only needed 24 supply points, I have a feeling that Germany is going to be saying, hey, give us all of your excess, and then we could plug in a number. Maybe they would be easy on us and they would only take 50 supply points that we would then transfer to Germany from here. But we won't really send them there. We'll come back here. We'll look down at an overview of the factories, so we can look for each type of factories. We can see what do we have functioning once closed, what's being dismantled, what's evacuating, and what's retooling. So functioning, of course, that's just the regular old thing, you're working. Closed means that for whatever reason it is not functioning right now. Dismantling is, in fact, closed, I should say, if we close the factory, then the factory remains in place, but the manpower is gone. So it can't produce anything. But the factory is still there with everything that it needs. And if we transfer manpower back to that factory, then it can go back into operation quite quickly. Dismantling, on the other hand, means that we're taking the manpower away because we need to use it someplace else, and we're also dismantling the factory itself. It won't be there anymore once the dismantling is complete, but we will recover the raw material points that we used to build that factory in the first place. That required some number of points, and we'll get those back after we dismantle it. Evacuating, same sort of thing. It'll close down for a while, and then it will reopen at some point in a new position. Retooling, that's what happens when you want to change. So, for example, maybe you were producing ME 109s in this factory, and suddenly you now have the technology level to produce V1s. Well, you have to retool to do that. You can't just magically say, now I'm going to start producing V1s here. So you take a turn to retool, and you take a resource point in order to do that. And then the next cycle, you can start outputting V1s from the same aircraft factory that was previously producing ME 109s or whatever it was. So that's the status for each one of those things. We can go in and manage those factories, and we could close it, dismantle it, destroy it, evacuate it. We could upgrade it, and upgrade it would be that tech level, so that we would be going, allow us to go from producing ME-109s to producing V1s or V2s or whatever. Retooling, I should say. And we could also adjust the manpower, so we'll pick the manpower here, see how it works. And it's showing us here's the factory 1001 and Hex 9090, which happens to be Mount Doom. And we can see this is the manpower that is currently assigned. And maybe we want to get our Mordor labor and send it someplace else and put some Elflandia labor in here. I'm not sure that there's any particular reason to do it in this case, but there are times when you will want to release certain kinds of labor in order to do something else with it, replace it with something for one reason or another. So we'll cancel that adjusting of manpower. We can also build new factories. So when we come in here to build a new factory, we would click on the map to say where is it that, in what hex do we want this factory to be built. In some cases, for example, the United States and the Soviet Union, you can also build factories that are off map. So we select the location, we pick the type of factory. I've got AFVs set up to do here. We're assuming that it's at tech level 2, so we can either build at tech level 1 or tech level 2, and building tankettes at tech level 1, or we could go to tech level 2 and we could produce light tanks. So we would select the factory type, the level, and the product for our new factory, and then we would assign the manpower points, because you've got to have manpower points to do it. All right, so we won't actually build it right now. We're going to cancel out of that. So here we've seen how we can adjust all those various conditions for existing factories, or we can build new factories, or we can go back to the factory and production menu here. So we've looked at that. There's the overview, the manpower, and the transfers as usual. So the point being for all that is you've got to take care of your manpower. You've got to take care of your raw materials. You've got to make sure that you have ample agriculture, and you can build your factories, you can assign the manpower, you can feed raw materials into them every turn, and they will produce, depending on the type of factory, supplies, equipment, some kind of artillery, some kind of vehicles, some kind of tanks, some kind of aircraft, some kind of ships, depending on what your factory is doing. Mordor doesn't have a lot of factories. So let's go back up here to the menu, and that takes us over to the last thing, which is armed forces. And I think you can kind of get the feel for where this is going, is that now that we're producing these armaments and we also have certain amounts of manpower that is qualified as military capable, we're going to be able to take the manpower points, equipment points, and anything necessary. For example, if it's going to be a tank division, we're going to have to get some vehicles and we're going to have to get some tanks, and we're going to assign those points in order to build the units that we want. And in that fashion, we're going to be able to build ground units, air units, and naval units. I'm going to do a separate demo on that because it'll take a fair amount of time to show that part, so I didn't want to stick it on the end of this demo. But to give you an idea of how it works, you can look at the existing YouTube video that I put together for the Soviet replacement system in Blitz 41, which is my computerized implementation of Fire in the East. And in the same way that the code works there to show the Soviet player exactly how many armor points, artillery points, infantry points he has, and what he can build with those numbers of points. And then he can select those things to build, and then depending on what points are remaining, it might reduce the things that he's capable of building at that time because he no longer has enough armor points because he just spent them all. The same sort of thing will be happening here. This will also look, to a certain extent, it will look something like the old War in the East production spirals, if you're familiar with those, in the sense that depending on what type of unit you choose to build, it will take fewer or greater number of turns to get that unit trained and ready to go to the front. You also pick the hex in which it's going to be trained. So if you're just going to put together an infantry battalion, and that might cost you 1 manpower point, that would be 1 military manpower point, 1 equipment point, a supply point, and it might be ready this player turn or maybe next player turn. On the other hand, if you decide that you want to make a panzer division, well, that's going to take more manpower points, more equipment points, vehicle points, armored fighting vehicle points, supply points, and it's going to take longer to produce that, but it will eventually get spit out. Anyway, I'll do that demo separately and show how all that works. So the bottom line is, this is my idea. Still very much testing, experimenting, debugging, trying to figure out how I want to put it all together. This is my idea of how to have an overarching resources and production module that would work for a multiplayer, computerized, web-based Grand Europa game. And if some of this looked interesting to you, please let me know what you think. Should it be easier? Are there things that I've left out, even though it might make it more complicated? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed seeing what I'm doing, and I hope to get back soon with the concluding part of this, with the demo on how to actually build ground, air, and naval forces for Grand Europa. Thanks for watching.